There's no way a fat kid like you could be mine. Get lost, you pig.
Nick shouted angrily, and I stepped in to protect Tony. If you won't acknowledge Tony as your own child, then I'll take him in. Later, after discovering that Tony had appeared on TV, my son and his wife came to the house.
Tony, let's go home with us.
To these two, Tony responded,
Who are you people?
I'm Hannah White. Ever since my husband passed away a few years ago, I've been living alone. Living alone in a big house was lonely. I didn't have any particular hobbies, so every day was boring beyond belief. But there was one thing I looked forward to. That was seeing my grandson, Tony. Meeting my adorable grandson Tony was my only source of comfort. My son Nick and his wife Wendy run a nightclub together. It seems to be doing reasonably well, as they always appear busy. They had a baby when they had been married for a few years. Apparently, they had a plan to have a daughter and make her the poster girl for their club. Before the baby's gender was even clear, they went on a shopping spree for baby girl items, eagerly anticipating the arrival of a daughter. However, when the baby was born, it turned out to be a boy. The disappointment for both of them upon learning it was a boy was significant. I thought that once they saw the baby, they would find him adorable no matter what. I was optimistic, but it didn't turn out that way. Nick and Wendy showed little interest in the newborn baby and didn't seem inclined to take care of him much. They didn't even bother to think about the baby's name. I got fed up and suggested several options, from which they eventually chose the name Tony. They never showed any interest in Tony, no matter how much time passed. They were determined to have a girl next time, but they never conceived again. Over time, Wendy started to harbor what seemed like hatred towards Tony.
Our plan was ruined because Tony wasn't a girl. It's all your fault.
It seemed like Wendy harbored such misplaced hatred within her. Furthermore, Nick also started to adopt a cold attitude towards Tony, influenced by Wendy. If I had intervened at that point, perhaps things wouldn't have turned out this way. Eventually, Wendy stopped cooking meals for Tony. Wendy would leave a $5 bill on the table every day before heading out to work, and she wouldn't return until nearly dawn. Tony would spend the long evenings and nights alone. It must have been incredibly lonely for a young child to wait for their parents to come home all by themselves. Tony would use the money Wendy left to buy food from the convenience store every day. Tony, still very young, didn't consider nutritional balance and would often buy snacks like cake or potato chips from the convenience store. Additionally, there were times when he would eat discarded sandwiches. A child going to the convenience store alone every day inevitably stood out. The part-time worker at the convenience store felt sorry for Tony and secretly gave him some food. Thanks to this kindness, even on days when Wendy didn't leave any money, Tony never had to go without a meal. By the time Tony was in the 3rd grade, his weight had exceeded 70 kilograms. This was the result of his unhealthy diet consisting of cake, pizza, and snacks every day. Nick and Wendy were not happy about it. Since Tony gained weight, they started to hurl harsh words at him.
You've gotten so fat. Cut it out already. There's no way a fat kid like you could be mine. Get out of here, you're just a nuisance.
When I learned about these words being said, it felt like my heart was being torn apart. I couldn't imagine how Tony must have felt hearing such words from his own father. I worried about Tony, so I sometimes visited his house to check on him. I had a faint sense that Nick and Wendy harbored resentment towards Tony from their tone of voice. I visited them occasionally, partly to make sure that nothing terrible was happening to Tony. Unfortunately, one day, my fears turned out to be true.
There's no way a fat kid like you could be mine. Get lost, you pig.
As I opened the front door, I heard Nick shouting. I hurried towards the direction of the sound and saw Tony lying on the floor. Judging from him holding his cheek, Nick probably had hit him. Nick, what are you doing? I rushed to Tony's side and pulled him away from Nick to protect him. Looking at Tony, he stared at me with a vacant expression. It seemed like he had resigned himself to something, and I regretted causing such an expression on his still young face. Nick hadn't noticed my presence. His eyes were wide open as if they were about to pop out of his head. Do you even realize what you're saying? Tony is undoubtedly your child. I shouted at Nick. Even though Tony was my own child, I couldn't comprehend Nick's thinking at all. It was unbelievable to subject Tony, who was innocent, to such treatment just because he wasn't the desired girl. If you won't acknowledge Tony as your own child, then I'll take him in. My sudden words left both Tony and Nick bewildered. From there, things progressed smoothly. Nick and Wendy eagerly jumped at my offer, seeing it as a convenient way to get rid of their problem.
Thank you, Mom. Now we can focus on running the business, right, Wendy?
Yeah, thank you so much.
On the day I took Tony in, they said these words with brighter smiles than I had ever seen on them. Their smiles made me feel sad. I realized just how little they had cherished Tony. I had been watching, thinking that being with his biological parents would make Tony happy, but seeing this made me strongly regret not taking him in sooner. On our way back home, Tony said something like this.
I'm sorry. I'll grow up quickly and leave.
What is he saying? When I asked him again, Tony was expressionless.
You regret taking me in, don't you? You've been making scary faces since earlier.
Did I have such an expression? Tony looked down sadly. It's not that. I regret not doing this sooner. If only I had let go of the idea that being with my biological parents would make me happy sooner. That's right. I don't regret taking Tony in. What I regret is not separating him from those two sooner.
Am I bothering you?
Tony looked at me with anxious eyes. I hugged Tony tightly. Of course not. I'm confident that I love you more than those two ever did. Tony seemed unsure of what to do. After standing frozen like a stone for a while, he muttered softly.
This is the first time I've hugged.
Tears overflowed from my eyes. I made a firm decision to make this child happy, no matter what. From that day on, Tony became remarkably more energetic. He started laughing and talking much more than before, which was hard to believe considering his previous demeanor. Every day when he came back from school, he would happily tell me about his day while helping with dinner preparations. You look happy today, Tony. Did something good happen?
You know what? Something funny happened today. While we were singing in music class, a sparrow flew into the music room. And then the teacher made a big fuss. I wondered why, and it turns out the teacher is scared of birds. She was about to cry.
Tony chuckled, perhaps remembering the scene from earlier. Tony's presence was so adorable and endearing that I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with love. Perhaps because Nick had started eating healthier meals since coming to my place, Tony's body shape had become more standard. While still retaining the typical cuteness of a child, His jaw became sharper, making him look quite handsome. He shyly told me that he had started to get approached by girls at school more often. Tony was happy every day, and I felt relieved to see him like that. It was the day of the first parent-teacher meeting since I took Tony in. The teacher made a suggestion.
Would you consider having Tony take an IQ test at the hospital?
This suggestion made me anxious. It felt like they were implying there was a problem with Tony's intelligence. Is Tony falling behind compared to others? When I asked, the teacher waved her hand hastily.
No, quite the opposite. From my experience, Tony is likely gifted.
The term gifted was unfamiliar to me, and I felt a bit puzzled. According to the teacher, gifted refers to children who have innate high abilities compared to their peers. The teacher handed me a sheet of paper.
This is a graph showing his academic performance. As you can see, his grades have dramatically improved from a certain point.
Indeed, the sudden rise on the graph was noticeable. Looking at the dates on the horizontal axis, it was clear that the change occurred shortly after I took Tony in.
Since it was so sudden, I asked Tony if he had started attending a tutoring center or something. Even so, this kind of improvement is unusual. But that wasn't it. Apparently, Tony had been deliberately adjusting his performance to avoid getting good grades.
I didn't quite understand what the teacher meant, so I looked at Tony, who was sitting beside me. Noticing my gaze, Tony spoke up.
In my previous home, if they found out I was getting good grades, they didn't like it. They called me arrogant and hit me even more.
He shrugged his shoulders.
So, during tests, I deliberately left answers blank or wrote the wrong ones. I actually knew all the answers, though.
Tony smiled wryly.
Now, I don't have to do that, so I just take the tests normally. They're too easy and boring, though. I understand everything just by reading the textbook, so classes aren't interesting. I want to study something more challenging,
Tony said with a sigh. For a moment, I worried that the teacher might be offended by Tony's words, but I was relieved to see her laughing loudly.
What do you think? If Tony is gifted, we might be able to provide support that suits him. Would you consider having him take the test at the hospital?
If it would benefit Tony. With that in mind, I decided to take Tony to the hospital over the weekend.
Based on Tony's behavior at school and at home, as well as the results of the IQ test, there is a possibility that Tony is gifted,
the doctor said firmly. Tony's IQ was significantly higher than average, and I was surprised. I didn't know Tony was so intelligent. No wonder schoolwork is easy for him. I decided to hire a private tutor for Tony to fulfill his wish of studying more challenging subjects. The tutor is a veteran who graduated from a famous university in the UK and understands Tony's needs well.
It's more fun than schoolwork.
Tony was delighted. Tony passed the first-class math exam recommended by his tutor. When the tutor posted about it on social media as my proud student, it quickly went viral. Tony became an overnight sensation, and newspapers and television stations started coming to interview him one after another. One day, while spending time with Tony as usual, the doorbell rang. Oh. Have the reporters come already? There was still about 30 minutes until the interview time. Assuming it was the reporters, I opened the door and was surprised.
It's been a while, Mom. We've come to pick up Tony.
There was Nick and Wendy. What brings you here? When I asked, Wendy smiled and said,
Thank you for taking care of Tony. From now on, he'll be living with us.
I was taken aback by her words. What is she saying now? Are you kidding? Tony has interviews scheduled. We're busy, so please leave. Upon hearing the word interview, Nick and Wendy's eyes sparkled.
I knew it. That was Tony after all.
I saw him on TV. Our son is truly amazing.
The two exchanged looks, clearly excited. And then, they said something unbelievable.
Once Tony comes back, our store will be secure.
Wendy nodded along beside Nick.
If customers come for Tony, our sales will increase more than ever.
And in the future, he can take over the business. It'll make things easier for us.
I'm appalled by the selfish thoughts of those two. They said Tony wasn't theirs, but as soon as they found out Tony is talented, they came to take him back. Tony, a child, isn't parents' property. I've had enough. When I was determined to give them a piece of my mind, Tony appeared behind me. Seeing Tony, Nick and Wendy smiled. Their smiles only fueled my irritation further. However, those smiles of the two were shattered by Tony's few words.
Who are you guys?
Tony looked straight at the two of them and said. They couldn't hide their confusion.
Who? We're your mom and dad. You're our dear child I gave birth to with a lot of pain.
Wendy's words made me sick. To call him their dear child, how could they say that? As I was about to say something in response, Tony chuckled softly.
My only parent here is her. I don't know you who abandoned me.
Tony said firmly.
Tony, she's your grandma, not your parent. Come home with us.
Nick said gently, trying to reason with him. Tony glared at Nick.
My home is this house with Grandma. Unlike you two, Grandma has shown me love. You're not my parents. You abandoned me and then come to take me back when you find me useful.
This is the first time Tony has raised his voice so much. Nick and Wendy's faces contorted in dismay. Nick, visibly frustrated, reached out to grab Tony's arm. Just as I moved to intervene, a voice called out from behind Nick.
Is what he just said true? That you abandoned him?
Reporters gathered around with solemn expressions. They were here to interview Tony. It seemed the appointed time had passed without notice. The reporters surrounded Nick and Wendy. Then they aimed their cameras at the two and fired a barrage of questions. Caught off guard, Nick and Wendy were left flustered. Days later, this interview aired on TV. The sad past of a genius boy, investigating the parents who abandoned him. The title was sensational and it had a tremendous impact. The two faced a backlash on social media and received numerous critical phone calls to their shop.
It's unthinkable to abandon a child just because it's not a girl.
Don't try to manipulate a child for your own convenience.
In addition to these phone calls, apparently many people gathered to catch a glimpse of the faces of such terrible parents. Naturally, the situation made it almost impossible to operate the store normally. Desperate, Wendy sought help from her parents, only to receive a cold response.
You reap what you sow. Deal with it yourself. We won't help someone who abandons their own child.
Nick and Wendy were scorned and abandoned by everyone. They're making fuss about why they were facing such consequences, but it was clearly the result of their own actions. It would be good if this could be a turning point for them to repent. But from what I can see, it's unlikely. After that incident, Tony and I immediately moved away.
I want to cut ties with those two. I can't stand going through something like that again.
I respected Tony's wishes, and we moved far away to ensure that those two would never come near Tony again. It would have been ideal to take legal action, but even though we had adopted him, severing ties with biological parents is difficult. At Tony's new school, he made good friends. One of them seemed to understand Tony well. At home, Tony would bring his friend over to show him his self-made programming projects, enthusiastically explaining his intricate details. While Tony's technical obsessions are too difficult for me to grasp, his friend seemed to understand, nodding along and listening attentively as Tony talked. Sometimes, the two would engage in deep discussions about programming together. Watching Tony always looking so happy, I truly felt moving here was the right decision. Thanks to meeting such a good friend, Tony can live each day happily and freely. I want us to continue living together, getting along well and helping each other.